This month in houses of worship across the country, folks are speaking and singing about climate change as part of the Interfaith Power and Light's annual preach-in on climate change. This is also the Sunday on which we mark the decade of the 80s and 90s with some of our music, on the way to our big 50th anniversary celebration on April 12th. For Unitarian Universalists, environmental concerns and the 80s come together in the story of the seventh Unitarian Universalist principle. Until 1985, there were only 6 guiding Unitarian Universalist principles, the original 6. The language of those original principles was adopted in 1961 when the Universalist Church of America and the American Unitarian Association merged. More than 20 years after the merger, it was becoming clear to many Unitarian Universalists that the principles needed to be updated. I hope I don't get in trouble for saying this, but they were never great in the first place. They included language like the dignity of man and world brotherhood. Reverend Ken Collier has written that, quote, "This statement was so watered down and cobbled together that it had only one virtue: it permitted merger to go through," end quote. That's Ken Collier. I can give you Ken's email address if you'd like it. A group of Unitarian Universalist feminists meeting at a conference in Michigan in 1980 did the Unitarian Universalist Association a great favor by pointing out that these principles needed a major overhaul. So a review process was begun. At the end of that process, in 1984, that major overhaul with 6 new principles was proposed to be voted on by delegates from UU congregations at our annual General Assembly. Statements of the values Unitarian Universalism aspires to. They included the language that many of us Unitarian Universalists have come to know well: the inherent worth and dignity of every person, the right to a free and responsible search for truth and meaning, the use of the democratic process in our congregations and in society at large, and so forth. They're listed in the front of our hymnal and on the website and on and on. But as that proposal in 1984 twisted its way through the Unitarian Universalist universe, some people began to raise a concern. A growing band of Unitarian Universalists thought all 6 of the new principles, like the original ones, were somewhat individualistic. There was no mention of interdependence and no mention of the non-human world. What about plants and animals and water? People were mobilizing to vote against the new principles unless something was added. The 6 new principles came to the floor by themselves, and after some arguing, which is a sacrament for Unitarian Universalists, Reverend Paul LaRue stood to propose an addition, a 7th principle. There was some wordsmithing, but eventually the entire proposal, 7 principles, was adopted. The 7th Unitarian Universalist principle reads this way: "We covenant to affirm and promote respect for the interdependent web of all existence, of which we are a part." Reverend Ken Collier, again, one of the people who worked to add a principle on interdependence back in 1984, writes, "The basic idea came from thinking about biology, especially ecology. One of the basic principles of ecology is that no living thing exists in isolation from its environment. Every creature and every species depends on every other for its existence, so that the elimination of a species necessarily weakens an environment and endangers the existence of all the remaining species, ours included. It is a law," he concludes, "as inexorable as gravity." Interdependence. Most often, Unitarian Universalists think about environmentalism when we talk about this principle, but there is more to it than that. This principle calls us to a change in the way we view the world, a change in guiding stories, maybe especially for us North Americans. The old American myth tells us that Europeans came to this land and by their own blood, sweat, and with many tears, tamed it to their purposes. America became the place where the individual could come and, if that individual worked hard enough, carve out a good life. Western movies tell us tales of individuals who face challenges. Among those challenges, the people who are native to this land. But by the end of the movie, the hero either vanquishes all obstacles or makes them surrogate white people. That myth was never true. You know already that Europeans came here and used the native people as resources, moved them out of the way when they weren't of use in perpetuating the American myth. Even brought over people from another continent to do the work of bending this land to their purposes. Behind the Protestant work ethic is a story of horror, evil, perpetrated on millions of people. Reverend Dr. Rebecca Parker, a Unitarian Universalist theologian, wrote, "Evil is that which exploits the lives of some to benefit the lives of others." Reinhold Niebuhr added, "Evil is not to be traced back to the individual, but to the collective behavior of humanity." And so we look back at the conduct of the founders of our nation, and we must name the product of their actions evil, the working of the system evil. We must move from the old myth of bending people and bending the earth to our purposes by the sweat of our brow to a guiding story of our interdependence on one another and on the earth. This is soul work. Greed is the great enemy in the work, as it feeds on the illusion that I can have everything I want with no consequences. Greed is with all of us. We and our elective leaders have much soul work to do. There's a stretch of land just east of the border of an Apache reservation called by the Apache Chichil-Bildogatil, meaning red medicine place, named Oak Flat by English speakers. It's a 2,400-acre land parcel. It's been a sacred meeting place for Apache since prehistoric times, a holy site still today where medicinal plants are gathered and coming-of-age ceremonies are held. Though it's not reservation land, it's part of Arizona's Tonto National Forest and has been protected from mining interests since Eisenhower's administration. The American government has no real interest on what is on the surface of that patch of land. What is below that land is another story. There is deep below Oak Flat's surface a rich deposit of copper ore. For years, lawmakers have been finagling, trying to swap land owned by companies for land managed by the government. Until recently, their efforts had not been successful. But a few months ago, our senators were working late to pass a federal defense spending bill. And at the last minute, just before the spending bill passed, Senator John McCain and some others attached a midnight rider that transferred the Oak Flats campground from the U.S. Forest Service to Resolution Copper Mining Company. The Resolution Company plans to open a $61.4 billion mining operation by mid-2020. The effect of that work will make much of Oak Flat a crater. A recent Tucson Sentinel article reports Arizona Senator John McCain touted the legislation to the Cronkite News, saying Arizona is the largest copper-producing state in the nation, which is why support for this legislation remains strong in my home state. He hasn't talked to everybody in his home state, has he? But tribal members said the government never consulted the tribe. This is a human and religious rights issue, and it's undermining tribal sovereignty if this continues, said a tribal council member from the San Carlos Apaches, one of their districts. The U.S. can still make these corrections, he said. The legislation authorizing the land sweep specified that the Secretary of Agriculture would consult with, quote, affected Indian tribes. However, San Carlos Apache Chairman Terry Rambler said government officials have not valued the tribe's concerns. Rambler previously told Cronkite News, the article goes on, that meaningful consultation would have meant the tribe had an opportunity to change the outcome. But in this case, he said, we're just like a check mark in the process. Protesters have been camping at the site for the last 3 weeks, asking for the government to negotiate with them. We don't know what happens next. The myth of independence, of the American dream being based on the ability to twist the earth and manipulate people to our ends, continues. And in the meantime, the temperature of the earth continues to increase, in part because of efforts like this one. We're hurting one another and marring the face of the earth. One of the most important sacraments in the soul work it will take to change our ways is to reach out to those in power, like Senator McCain. You'll have a chance to do that before you leave campus this morning. Members of VUU's Green Sanctuary team are ready to help you convince our leaders to reduce global warming by sending a note to your senator. Or you can sign a pledge that will go to the UN climate talks in Paris later this year. And you can sign up to get information updates on climate issues too. It's easy just to be resentful and cynical. And I am resentful. And I think many of you are too. We're sick and tired of people who claim to represent us abusing our neighbors and the earth. But in America, we've been doing this kind of thing for a long, long time. We should be angry, but we need to do more than just find individuals to condemn. We need to find ways to emphasize our interdependence, ways to remember day after day, year after year, that we depend on one another and the earth. Living in intentional community like this one is one of those ways. We need to remember that each of us, because we are alive, uses resources from the earth, but that every resource we use affects us all, a deeply interdependent web. Someone who, for me, personifies this living in covenant relationship with the earth is, I call her Unitarian Universalist Poet Laureate. I don't think that's an official title, Mary Oliver. One of her poems illustrates the fact that we can never finally escape our interdependent relationship with the earth. It is titled, "What was once the largest shopping center in northern Ohio was built where there had been a pond I used to visit every summer afternoon." So you kind of know what it's about. She writes, "Loving the earth, seeing what had been done to it, I grow sharp, I grow cold. Where will the trilliums go and the colt's foot? Where will the pond lilies go to continue living their simple, penniless lives, lifting their faces of gold? Impossible to believe we need so much as the world wants us to buy. I have more clothes, lamps, dishes, paper clips than I could possibly use before I die. Oh, I would like to live in an empty house with vines for walls and a carpet of grass, no planks, no plastic, no fiberglass. And I suppose sometime I will. Old and cold, I will lie apart from all this buying and selling with only the beautiful earth in my heart." Our perceived separation from one another, our perceived separation from the earth made possible by automobiles and nice homes and cell phones, it's an illusion. What might we do differently if in every waking moment we recognized our interdependence not only with other human beings, but with all life on earth? What might you do differently? What might I do differently? We're starting to do it. We're building and driving more efficient vehicles. We were mistaken for a Prius lot recently. Not really. I haven't joined the club. We're reaching out to our elected officials. We're doing the work. There's so much to do, but we are just the people to do it. So let us not grow weary. From cradle to grave, we live in relationship with the good earth, our source of being and our ultimate destiny. May we find ways in our lives to remember our covenant with her day after day after day. Amen.